In April of 1847, in a Riverbend county where the mud smelled of rot and money, something happened that unsettled the carefully arranged order of the plantations and parlors. Silas Hartwell, a man whose ledger dictated who lived and who owed, signed a paper in his study and then did the unthinkable in public view. He placed his adult daughter, Evelyn, under the legal and social authority of Amos Clay, an enslaved field hand from the far edge of the property. He did not frame it as a sale or a joke. He announced it as a remedy. Evelyn was 30. Her body, altered by isolation and a life lived within rooms, weighed more than most women in the county could imagine. And Silas said aloud that she required guardianship that neither family nor physicians could provide. By October, the household had shifted in ways no one on the riverbank could explain. Secrets rose like steam from a black kettle. 3 men were found dead with their throats opened and their faces frozen in disbelief. And the great house that defined what Hartwell meant to the county had a new smell beneath the perfume of varnish and beeswax, smoke, and something older, like bone. What really happened between the man who signed papers and the man who took a name like a tool? Before we peel back the varnish and read the ledger that should not have been opened, subscribe, ring the bell, and tell us in the comments which state you are watching from. Now let me take you back to that study where the oak desk smelled faintly of tobacco and shellac, where the light through the sash window cut rectangles of dust across the carpet, and where a letter had arrived with a red seal and a different kind of demand. The courier had stamped the date on the envelope, and the ink in Silas Hartwell's hand trembled for reasons he would not say aloud, but the ledger lay open beneath his palm. The county that held the Hartwell estate was a place of layered rules, a membrane social that separated who could speak and who must listen. The manor sat above a slope of cultivated fields that smelled of molasses and iron. The slave quarters crowded the back of the property, low and weathered, smelling of damp straw and sweat. The town had a courthouse that kept records that were not always true. You could tell a person standing by the way they tipped their hat, by the dates on their boots, by the way they avoided the creek at certain hours. The hierarchy was explicit and almost ceremonial. Planters like Silas were on top. Overseers like Jonas Mercer kept labor moving. House servants like Matilda Brown moved silently through rooms and knew the private tremors. Clergy like Reverend Tobias Reed proclaimed morality on Sundays and looked away on Mondays. Physicians like Doc Pierce prescribed tonics and distractions. And the enslaved, from Amos Clay. Talina and Cato at the quarters carried histories inside them that no ledger would officially note. The river, black in winter and spattered with oil in summer, divided landlords and laborers in a geography that felt ordained. The county paper printed notices about auctions and marriages, and one small paragraph about a ledger theft that most readers skimmed and forgot. Clara Whitcomb, Jonas Mercer, Sheriff Alden Price, Matilda Brown, Reverend Tobias Reed, Doc Pierce, Lena Clay, Cato, and Jonas's deputy Eli Turner were names that moved through neighborhood gossip. Each had a place, each reacted in a way that told us who they were. Some felt only curiosity, some felt outrage, some felt fear. The smell of molasses, the sound of a spoon tapping a saucer, the grit under boots, the heat pressing against shirt and collar, the metallic tang of coins passed in secret, these were the textures of daily life that made the stakes of a single paper so dangerous. Evelyn Hartwell's backstory unfolded like the slow reading of a brittle letter. As a child, she had been lively, hungry for stories, and she learned to love the rhythm of words read aloud by her mother, whose shawl always smelt faintly of lavender and flower. She remembered summer afternoons when a breeze moved through the curtains and dust danced like small planets. School lasted until she was 14, and then the ledger of marriage offers closed doors for her when her mother's death left her more fragile and more observed. She learned to eat to fill holes that no one named. The food was a consolation and a punishment. The county doctors wrote notes: overeating, melancholy, confinement. The formation of her identity was shaped by parlors and by whispers, by the way cousins looked at her, and by the way men assumed pity where desire should not be. Loss hardened her. The family's reputation became a glass case she could not escape. In the present, when Silas offered guardianship to Amos, Evelyn responded with a mixture of relief and silent terror, as if a hand removed from her shoulder might be a mercy, and as if a hand added to it might be another holding down. Her memory smelled of starch and perfume, of the iron cool of the front gate, of the knot in her stomach when her father corrected the way she laughed. Amos Clay's backstory was of a different sort, but equally full. He was born in a lean winter, his mother working until the moon was small and hard, her hands stained with tobacco. As a boy, he learned to move with his eyes rather than speak, to count birds of knots in rope, to know the hours by the way the light fell on fence posts. Formation for Amos was the field and the rhythm of seasons. He learned woodcraft from an old man named Cato who whistled while he taught knots, and he learned to listen. Loss came early when his brother was sold, a name struck through in the ledger and gone. That loss lodged in Amos's chest as a place of cold, and he began to keep his own ledger in the stitching of his shirt, wrinkled fabric marked with dates and small pictographs. In the present, he moved through the Hartwell property with hands skilled in repair and with a mind that saw small injustices as patterns to be noted. When Silas announced the transfer, Amos accepted the authority because refusal was a risk that multiplied for people who had been taught to be small. But acceptance did not mean agreement. Inside, he held a private council about what could and could not be done, balancing a person's dignity against the pressure of a master's rule. The move that changed everything came with an incident, inciting that read like a short legal note but felt like a rope around a neck. A ledger page had gone missing from Silas Hartwell's account book, a page that recorded payments and names and something more, a list of donations to a so-called benevolent society that in truth was a circle of men who performed rituals in the cellar and who kept a ledger of favors for services rendered. That missing page mentioned the name of a man in town and a payment described with a word that made reverends and sheriffs frown. Doc Pierce found a scrap of paper stained with ink behind a wine barrel in the pantry. The choices that followed were public and private: call the sheriff, hide the paper, confront a neighbor, or burn the evidence. There was a reading of the paper, a moment in the parlor when the family circle tightened, the fireplace throwing light and shadow across faces like an accusation. The moral tension was such that small noises seemed large. The decision to hand Evelyn over was explained as a protective measure, a legal guardianship to allow her to be supervised by Amos, whose hands were steady. The county believed, or wanted to believe, that Silas acted out of paternal concern, but whispers suggested the ledger contained more than charity notes. The reading of documents, the sound of seal wax cracking, the smell of tobacco and tight paper, the scratch of a quill, these sensory details followed each decision like a seam. What should have been a private fix became a public wound. The pact between Amos and Evelyn began as a cautious accord and quickly became the seed of rumor and conspiracy. They spoke in the laundry house where Matilda Brown brought linens and where the air smelled of boiled starch. They spoke under the eaves where rain hit tin with a steady hand. They spoke in the garden where basil and sage grew in thin rows. Their first scene of alliance is a scene of many small exchanges that reveal character. And strategy, a dialogue stretched to hold the weight of an entire household's observation. Amos, Evelyn said quietly, her voice like cloth rubbing against wood. They say I am to be yours to watch. I did not ask for this, Amos replied, voice low and even, the scent of sweat and wood smoke clinging to him. But I will not harm you. We will keep things as simple as we can. Simple, she laughed once, a sound thin as a coin, is not a word I know how to live with. Then teach me how to be gentle, Amos answered, and a faint furrow crossed his brow. I will show you where to sit when crowds come and how to hide the ledger's missing pages, she said, and her fingers found the seam of his sleeve. Why would you hide them? Amos asked, turning his head to study her face in the dim. Because names can kill as well as pistols, she said. Because my father would rather see the names burn than the ledger open, Amos replied. And what of me? She said, and there was a tremor in her question. We will make choices together, he said. Tell me what scares you. Being looked at as if I am blame, she answered. Being moved like furniture, Amos said, and his words landed like stones. Then we will set boundaries, she said, and the plan began in the gentleness of an agreement whispered during the washing of shirts. Who will know? Amos asked. Only Matilda and Lena and you and I, she answered. And maybe Jonas, if he must, Amos said, reluctant. Do not let Jonas know more than he needs to, Evelyn said. He will tell the sheriff before he tells the son, Amos replied. We will take the ledger's pages that reveal the society and photocopy them, Evelyn suggested. And Amos paused. The idea of copying words a strange modernity in a world that counted truth by signature. And how do you propose we copy them? He asked. Slowly and in the dark, she answered, and the plan settled like a small stone on the bottom of a pond. Each exchange was a stroke of strategy, a map of who could be trusted, and there were at least 10 sharp shifts in tone and direction as they detailed who would fetch papers, who would stand watch, who would distract, who would sing when needed. Each exchange was punctuated by sensory anchors, the scrape of a chair leg, the scent of starch, the soft chink of a metal basin, the way rain made patterns on the roof, the taste of coffee that warmed their hands. By the time the plan was set, they had rehearsed responses and contingency plans, a litany of small acts that would add up if executed precisely. There were technical descriptions of how evidence would be handled, written in a way meant for hands that did not often handle ink. Step 1 involved excising a column from a ledger without tearing the binding, turning a corner of a page until the fibers yielded, then laying the sheet on a flat board and rubbing powdered charcoal into the ink to reveal impressions, making a paper impression for later transcription. Step 2 was the replication method, a simple contact print achieved by moistening a thin sheet and pressing it onto the ink while the back was rubbed with the blunt end of a spoon to pull letters through. Step 3 described storing the copy in a hollow post in the barn wrapped in oiled cloth to keep damp at bay. Each technical note required careful hands and an escape route. The description of extraction and copy ran to 312 characters in the planning notes, precise enough to sound professional, but simple enough for someone with calloused hands to follow. Their infiltration of the manor's private spaces became an exercise in stealth and social theater. They timed their movements to the table rhythms of dinner plates and the loud singing of Reverend Reed on Sundays. They used the presence of Sheriff Price at a far meeting to open a trunk, the sound of boots on stairs muffled by rugs, the light from a candle blurred by a lace curtain. The scene where they found the ledger pages in a false bottom of a wine chest had at least 7 sensory hits. The smell of aged port, the taste of old iron on the tongue when a nail was pulled free, the scrape of wood releasing dust that made the eyes smart, the cool of the metal corner caught between fingers, the sound of fabric whispering as paper slid out, the sight of ink blotted and deliberate, the weight of a name like a stone in the palm. They copied each page with a hand method that left smudges and then smoothed the copies with a warm stone. There were witnesses nearby, a servant named Matilda who hummed at the stove and who later would hold a bowl in her hands, pretending not to see. There was Jonas Mercer elsewhere on the fields, as if Providence timed everything. As the copy circulated, tensions ratcheted. Several moments of pitched tension slowed time like a pond freezing in a storm. The first such moment occurred at the well when Sheriff Alden Price confronted Amos with words like accusations. The air was thick with heat, and the sound of children playing seemed distant. Amos felt a hand close around his arm and thought he would be dragged into a legal chamber where his words meant nothing. He looked at Price and said calmly, "You will not make a crime of a kindness," and then jerked his arm free, the motion sudden and shocking to onlookers. The feeling of soil under nails, a slight sting as the sun beat down, and the smell of river algae mixed in that breath. The second, slow tension came in the circle of the Benevolent Society when Reverend Reed offered a bargain in a voice that used prayer like a blade. Silence pressed in until a glass broke and someone yelled a name. The third was the night Amos hammered at the back door while flames licked a far granary and neighbors screamed into the dark, their voices like torn cloth. Each of these moments was expanded, described, and slowed so that you could feel the skin tighten and the chest hold its breath for 500 to 600 characters of compression and release, each paragraph closing on the sound of a single step. The bargaining scene in the Manor's cellar became public in the worst possible fashion. The Benevolent Society, which met with candles and a ledger, had more to hide than charity. They had rituals that required silence and small seals stamped into envelopes, and they kept lists of favors that were owed and would be called in. In a dialogue that stretched and jagged like a rope pulled taut, Reverend Tobias Reed spoke first, his voice full of scriptural cadence. "Silas," he said, "we have given you cover for many years." "You have given me none," Silas replied, the scent of brandy on his breath, the shadow of the ledger between them. "Evelyn's condition is a thing of family sorrow," Reed answered, placing his hand on a wooden table and feeling the grain like a pulse. "And yet your ledger holds names that do not belong to charity," Silas said. "Those names are necessary," Reed answered. "Necessary for what?" Silas demanded. "For the preservation of order," Reed said calmly. "And what is order when bodies are traded as if they were marks in a ledger?" Jonas Mercer asked, voice rough. "This is not barter," Reed said. "It is mercy handled badly," Matilda said from the corner, the smell of starch in her hair. "Mercy," Amos said, and the word left his lips like a stone, "is not something you keep on a shelf to call back when convenient." "You overstep," Sheriff Price said, slapping a palm on the table. "You want to set the household against itself," Doc Pierce observed, leaning forward, the room smelling faintly of antiseptic. "I want to set truth against silence," Evelyn said, and for a moment the cellar was so quiet you could hear the drip of water from a pipe. The bargaining moved through accusations, offers, threats, and finally a proposition. Remove the ledger pages in exchange for silence on certain names. Amos and Evelyn refused a direct bargain at first, and then were offered a different choice, one that split like glass. The dialogue contained at least 12 distinct exchanges, each line quick, each response a measurement of moral fiber, and the room felt like a jury deciding not only on actions, but on what the community would accept as right. When refusal hardened, the county reminded everyone that power can be structural. And quick. The capture scene followed a pattern of deception. Amos was seized one night as he went to hide a copy in the hollow of a fence post. He did not struggle. He let hands take him because he understood the calculus of survival. "You will confess," Sheriff Price told him under a lamp that threw his face into caricature. "I do not have the words you seek," Amos said with a patience that was not defeat. "You will tell us who else knows," Price insisted. "You know my face," Amos replied, looking at the sheriff as if he could see the ledger carved into the man's hands. "You will pay for this," Silas warned from the shadows. "Pay with what?" Amos asked. "With everything you took," Silas spat, and the cellar filled with the smell of sweat and fear. Their negotiation became a public performance, with neighbors like Clara Whitcomb and Jonas Deputy Eli Turner watching like weather watchers. There was a technical explanation of how confessions were handled in such cases, a process of questioning that included leading prompts, repeated sleep deprivation, and the use of known friends as interlocutors to elicit names. That technical description was written to be about 300 characters, clinical and cold, because the mechanisms of coercion are often functional and bureaucratic. Violence escalated the night the ledger pages were shown to men who felt their honor was being questioned. 2 of the men who had been listed as donors were found dead, their throats opened with a precision that suggested someone who knew anatomy. The county whispered of ritual, of reprisal, and of a justice that would not be met by law, but by fire. The climax that followed was a sequence of action with sensory overload. The crack of timber breaking under flame, the smell of smoke that made eyes stream with mortar and vinegar, the heat like a hand pushing through a crowd, the sight of figures moving as dark silhouettes against orange, the sound of horses stamping, the metallic ring of a pan used as an alarm, the taste of ash on the tongue of someone standing too close. In one segment of the uprising, a moment slowed down for the reader to feel the decision. Amos stood at the edge of the house watching a man who had signed his name to a ledger that used bodies as currency. Amos had the chance to strike or to refuse. He remembered the boy that had been sold, the ledger with a scratched-out column, the way Evelyn had folded her hands when she learned what names meant. He raised his hand and did something that would be called vengeance and justice by different people. The act itself remained unsensationalized, described with restraint, but with the knowledge that violence is both a physical and moral rupture. There were 3 distinct tension beats during the uprising, each stretched to 500 to 600 characters, the narrative slowing so that the reader could feel the rope of time tighten before it snapped. After the flames and the arrests, the community fractured. Some called for law, others for secrecy, and others for memorials that would not name names. The ledger's missing pages were either destroyed or hidden, and new rumors took root like weeds. In the weeks that followed, several scenes unfolded that demanded explanation, including a ritual that the Benevolent Society performed to justify its actions. The ritual was described in technical terms: the stamping of a wax seal with a family emblem, a pattern of invocation that relied on names being offered as currency, and a compact whereby those named could be called upon in times of need. The technical account of the ritual's procedure was written in 310 characters, clear and clinical, so that the ritual's mechanics were visible without romanticizing the depravity that can come when power cloaks itself in ceremony. At roughly 1/3 of the way through this story, after the county had been described and after the first ledger revelation had been made, I want to pause and ask you to participate. If this account has unsettled you as it did those who lived it, please do 2 things now. First, write a comment that begins either with the word justice or the word injustice, and then say why you chose that word. Keep your answer short, 1 or 2 sentences. Second, if you feel this investigation matters, subscribe to the channel and press the bell to receive future episodes where we dig into records, run expert interviews, and try to reconstruct truths that have been buried. Your comments inform our research. They tell us what to investigate next and help us find people willing to share documents or memories, names of local historians, and families with papers in attics. We use community responses to guide primary source visits and archival requests. The simple act of naming a reaction helps us know what direction to push our next camera or ledger leaf toward. Now we go back to the narrative to see how a household's decision became a county's reckoning. After the uprising, the legal machinery began to grind with polite cruelty. Trials were convened where testimony was uneven and where the definitions of possession and guardianship were argued down long hallways. People like Reverend Reed testified for mitigation, while Sheriff Price insisted on strict reading of statutes. Matilda Brown and Lena Clay gave accounts that were cautious and damning at once, their names called to the stand and repeated in hushed town talk. Clara Whitcomb gave a statement that shifted depending on who visited her parlor. Jonas Mercer vanished from the fields for a week and later maintained he had been at the overseer's house. Doc Pierce delivered a medical assessment that used euphemisms when blunt facts were needed. The community's reaction was varied and named. Some liquidated ties and moved north. Some stayed and mourned silently. Some conspired to rebuild reputations. There was a trial that consumed 2 weeks and produced a verdict that satisfied neither the bereaved nor those who had been accused of charting atrocities. In the aftermath, there were epilogues that extended into months, small chronologies of memory and consequence that showed how a single act rippled outward. 1 month after the events, the county still smelled of smoke and damp ash. People visited the ruins and took small pieces of charred wood as relics or proof. Evelyn sat in a parlor of a cousin's house, her hands wrapped around a cup that steamed, and she would not speak of the ledger's names. Amos was kept in a cell where the light came through a barred window and cut his face into stripes. Matilda continued to iron shirts, her hands steady but her eyes often on the horizon. At roughly 3 months, the community had split into factions that openly refused to trade with one another. The manor's remaining books were sealed away in a lawyer's vault, and rumors spread that a neighboring county had offered silence in exchange for land. Clara Whitcomb moved to town and opened a bakery, the smell of fresh bread a small attempt to make a new normal. At 6 months, the shock had diminished into memory, like scab tissue, but pockets of resistance remained. A new ledger appeared, written by hands that vowed no more secret columns, carried in a trunk by an unnamed sympathizer who would not say where the paper had come from. The epilogue across these 3 temporal points shows how the story did not simply end with fire or trial. It continued in small acts, in the way Matilda's grandchildren told the story, in the faint name left in a parish register, in the rumor that a copy of the ledger had been slipped to an abolitionist in another state. Those 3 moments together are recorded in roughly 2,200 characters that capture a shifting landscape of grief, secrecy, and stubborn memory. Across all of this, the question remained of legacy. Some called the events justice, some called them revenge. The ledger, whether burned or hidden, remained the central symbol of what had been traded in the county. At the very end, a small sealed envelope was found in an attic by a girl who loved old paper. Inside was a single page torn from a ledger and a pressed sprig of lavender, Evelyn's favorite scent. The page bore several names and a note that read simply, "Remember." The community's memory persisted in fragments and in the way children learned which houses to avoid at dusk. Silence, once a protection for the powerful, became porous and vulnerable to the smallest leak. The moral weight of what happened, whether you call it justice or injustice, rests in the choices made when someone with power decides where to place responsibility for a body and someone without power decides how to respond. If this reconstruction moved you and you want more investigations like this, subscribe for deeply researched stories built from ledgers, diaries, and the testimony of descendants and historians. Share your thoughts below, starting with justice or injustice, and tell us why. Your response guides our next visits to archives, our requests for interviews, and the stories we choose to bring to light. In the end, when the final embers cooled, what remained were names scratched into the memory of a place and a small collection of documents that proved the obvious truth. Silence preserves the guilty, and remembering is a small, stubborn act of repair.